Welcome, everybody. My name is Jody Chow, and I'm the Chief of Staff to the Technology team here at Cedar. Thanks for joining us for the first in a new series of virtual fireside chats called Cedar Tech Bytes. In this series, we will focus on technical topics that we hope provides helpful insight to the engineering community. Today, we're delighted to have Bill Magnuson of Braze with us in conversation with our Chief Technology Officer, Hassan. Today's virtual event will conclude in about 1 hour. And as a reminder for those who haven't joined us at one of Cedar's previous events, our speakers can't see or hear the audience, so please use the chat function in the Stage tab to post questions or comments. We'll be saving time for a few audience questions at the end of the conversation, so please do chime in. Now that housekeeping's out of the way, I'm very excited to introduce Bill Magnuson, co-founder and CEO of Braze, a customer engagement platform that delivers messaging experiences across push, email, in-app, and more. Bill began his journey in mobile at Google, working on App Inventor for Android, and is continuously looking for ways to humanize the relationships between brands and customers to create stronger, more sustainable, and valuable relationships utilizing technology. He was named a 2019 Digiday Future Leader and one of Inc. magazine's 2017 30 Under 30 Brilliant Young Entrepreneurs. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your experience with us, Bill. Hassan, over to you.
Thanks, Jody. Hey, Bill, thanks for hopping on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to see you.
Likewise. So for those listening who aren't as familiar with you as I am, can you talk to us about your formative years, what initially got you interested in technology as a career, Google, your master's work, transition to Bridgewater?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll kind of tell my life story here in 60 seconds. So I was born and raised in Minnesota. I grew up in a pretty rural area, pretty far from many people my age, and technology was kind of the outlet that got me out of my house. And so I grew up on the internet, grew up playing with computers, built my first computer when I was still in middle school. And, definitely just always had a love for technology, for software, for the connectivity that the internet really represented. So I went to MIT and ended up studying computer science there. And actually in my senior year was when Android launched. And so I was fortunate enough to take a course called, it was like a mobile application building course, where Rich Miner, who's one of the Android founders, he was in Boston at the time. He would come into our Friday lectures and bring his dog in every week. And we had the pre-release launch G1s, which were that old kind of horizontal QWERTY keyboard slider phone, if you remember that. And so that was right there and coming to life right as I was graduating. And so as I left MIT, finished my undergrad, went and worked at Google. As was mentioned, I worked on this platform called App Inventor for Android. It was a visual programming language to help build Android applications, and we piloted it as an educational tool. A lot of people have probably seen the children and grandchildren of this project out in a lot of kids' toys nowadays. If you've ever seen like puzzle pieces that can be snapped together on an iPad app or whatever to control a robot, or maybe like a Harry Potter wand, or things like Scratch and Logo and Star Logo, are all in the same family of software. And so we worked with this really cool team, helping teach mobile application development to, at the time, college and high school students. It's now become even more usable and been able to go into the earlier years. But that gave me that exposure to mobile that I think allowed me to build such tremendous conviction that, mobile was going to fundamentally change the world, change our relationship with technology, much like the internet boom of the 90s that I was still a kid for and on the sidelines for. I saw the same tremendous change potential out of mobile and was really excited by it.
Cool. That's awesome. So what motivated you to finally leave Bridgewater in 2011 and start what would now be Braze?
Yeah, so I mean, continuing the story from Google, I was there for a little while. I went back to MIT and actually finished my master's degree, also in computer science there, and then went over to Bridgewater, where actually you didn't mention this, but Hassan was my boss when I started there, my manager. So, it wasn't that Hassan was a bad boss or anything. Definitely really loved my time there. But as I went into the finance industry after having really gotten the taste of the early days of mobile, I felt like I was on the sidelines for something that was just going to tremendously change the world. The advent of mobile, the kind of spread of it around the globe. It's now a technology that's been adopted more than anything that's come before it. potentially even including things like clean water and electricity. A smartphone, there's more than one smartphone now for every human on the planet. And we were still in the early days of that, but I was just so excited by the potential. There was also, I had been at Google, which was a tens of thousands of people company. Went to Bridgewater, which was around 1,000 people at the time when I came back. And, I really wanted to start the entrepreneurship journey from the ground floor from the very beginning. And so, the combination of that massive excitement I had around mobile, along with the desire to really take on an entrepreneurial journey, those came together and created this great opportunity for me to jump in head first, really. And we started Appboy, as it was called at the time. We've since rebranded to Braze about 4.5 years ago. But Appboy was actually founded in July of 2011. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary now, which is pretty crazy to think about.
Time flies. And I never thought of our relationship as a boss-employee relationship, and I guess that's why we're still friends.
Absolutely.
From that start, looking at now, Braze currently manages the relationships of billions of monthly active users on behalf of customers, sending tens of billions of personalized messages every month. You're one of the biggest digital platforms in the world, with all the infrastructure and scaling challenges that come with that. How did it feel to scale to this level, and what were the key tech challenges? How did you evolve the technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been quite a journey along the way. I think there's this saying that there's only two ways to make money in business. One is to bundle, and the other is to unbundle. And when you kind of look at, the technology challenges and really how we've built and how we've differentiated over time, so much of it comes down to these decisions that we made in the very earliest days about, where are we going to vertically integrate? Where are we going to build abstraction layers, and where are we going to expose programmability? And so when we think about the kind of customer engagement problem from a technical design perspective, we actually built we built it from this holistic relationship building level. So we started out, enduring businesses are built on the back of long-term customer relationships. When we started in 2011, there weren't a lot of enduring businesses in mobile. It was more likely to be a 99-cent, fart soundboard, or like a flashlight utility app, or maybe some mobile game to sell you fish food or what have you. There was a lot of energy and excitement. Weren't a lot of enduring businesses being built, but we had strong conviction that there would be, and that mobile would also upend, the traditional enterprise. And so what we really wanted to build for was the long game. We wanted to support businesses in building those customer relationships. And we know that as humans, we build strong relationships through having good shared understanding, through having good shared experiences, through high quality conversations that are relevant and interesting to us. And so we approach the technology problem in the same way. We had a bit of an advantage in the sense that we didn't actually have any marketing technology background at all. And so our first principles that we were building from were not rooted in the legacy of marketing technology, which was almost all built to be batch processing or, batch oriented, backward looking, and had a bunch of assumptions around kind of how and where the consumer would engage with you that we didn't think. Well, we didn't even have the opportunity to think, because we didn't know about that, but they were just not well suited for this modern problem of needing to engage with someone interactively wherever they are. I like to call this your technology kind of experiencing the world as it happens, and being able to respond to it. And so we actually built our stream processing architecture with a design that is much more similar to a high frequency trading system than it would be to kind of any message sending technology that really existed at the time. And through the stream processing, essentially, having a abstraction layer at the top on listening to people, so that we can kind of listen and be there during the customer experience, integrating into apps and websites and into loyalty programs and other sorts of data sources. Then we had a step where we tried to understand. So, we start at the top. We want to be able to listen. Through the understand step, we really needed to vertically integrate everything that it took for classification. Who are we going to talk to? What kinds of things should they be eligible for? Orchestration, which is I have an opportunity to communicate with someone. How should I orchestrate that? How should I think about timing, et cetera? Personalization, which is really honing in on the message and improving the relevancy. So all of those things kind of come through that understand step. And then when it's time to take action at the end, where if we go back to that high frequency trading example, this is where we've now taken in new economic data, we've updated our models, applied our trading strategies. They might have outputted that we should make a trade or not. Within the messaging context, we've taken in a new user action, we've updated their user model, we've applied all the communication strategies that we have, and then we've decided whether we're going to send a message or not. And then what we importantly did as well is we built that abstraction layer at the bottom so that we could flexibly send a message depending on what was relevant for the message, content richness, urgency, looking at, user preferences. So much of what was built before us was really siloed, and it was constrained by the channel first, and then thinking about the customer. And we tried to be customer centric and think about the human and the relationship problem first, and then built that kind of unbundling abstraction layer at the bottom so that the communication happened at the end.
That's great. I like that analogy. But tell me a little bit about how you chose technologies early on and how those choices evolved as you scaled. Because I imagine there were some things early on that didn't work as you scaled and you had to change them.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely there were. And we were building a stream processing architecture, but it was before kind of commercial stream processors even existed, right? Like Confluent as a company, which I think a lot of people associate with stream processing now, wasn't founded until 5 years into our journey. And so we definitely had to kind of build a lot of these things from scratch. I do think that not having the, not really knowing what had happened in the marketing ecosystem before us really helped, because we did look at, we looked at it more from first principles, and we were using more modern approaches to data processing. I think also a key thing is that there's a big tension between completeness and responsiveness. And so if you think about just two financial problems, one of them being fraud detection, where someone swipes a credit card and you need a system that can kind of classify fraud or not very quickly, because the customer experience is going to suffer if you have to spend 10 minutes pouring through your data warehouse to determine whether or not it's okay for that charge to go through or not, versus like filing your taxes, where obviously completeness is more important than responsiveness. And I think that a key thing that we really had to build for was to optimize for responsiveness, because we were dealing with a mobile consumer who was, on the run, engaging with your brand whenever they wanted to, not when it was convenient for you. And there needed to be interactiveness, and the context around them is constantly changing because they've allowed the mobile device to permeate their lives. And that means that if you're going to communicate through it, you've got like a responsibility there. And so most of the scaling challenges that we've run into is that we always started with responsiveness first. We needed everything to be able to respond, not just in some bastardized definition of real time that means like, more than once a day, but actually immediately, instantaneously, in all cases, for all use cases. There's a lot of things there. We can dig into some of those if you'd like, but I would say the most surprising one, just based off of all of our experience before in schooling, was that we kept breaking the network. Load balancers, like concurrent SSL connections, like, we used to work with Rackspace, and we had like, hardware F5s, and we were just piling more and more of those up as we were dealing with causing our own thundering herd problems, because we would send out massive campaigns. And, before the campaign is even finished sending, all of these people are opening their mobile apps all at the same time. And then that's like sending a bunch of requests, which then is leading to more in-product messaging. And we would run into a lot of that. Similarly, we would onboard a new client, and you would bring on like a SoundCloud, and all of a sudden your infrastructure would like double overnight. And then the next week you'd add it. So it was like, we didn't have the benefit of kind of slow growth, but as we grew, we actually had step function growth as we brought in new big clients in the early days. And I feel like in school and a lot of other software engineering, even all the way through getting a master's degree, in computer science, the reality of dealing with the network was something that, we never really even talked about. And if you look at all of our early scaling challenges, so many of them were dealing with these massive mobile audiences, which in many cases are indistinguishable from a distributed denial of service attack, right? You've got these devices coming in from all over the world that are all establishing connections all at the same time, because you've caused that, because you've sent out these campaigns, and then they just like melt your infrastructure. So those were definitely some fun and interesting challenges.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people assume the internet just scales with them, and in reality that it terminates somewhere in your infrastructure, and that doesn't actually work. So speaking of different sort of organizations and tech stacks that might work or not work in different contexts, can you reflect a little bit on the different ones you've seen, like Google, Bridgewater, Braze? What have you learned from those different orgs and their tech stacks, and what worked and didn't work well?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question, and I've tried to. It's important to, I think, apply a lot of those learnings to the size of the company and what you're capable of as well. One of the biggest things at Google, and the most notable things about the developer experience there is just the the sheer level of the developer infrastructure. You run a build and it doesn't run on your local machine. It like establishes diffs and slices it up and sends it out to an entire data center to run it, and like comes back with partial results. And so you can and that's just like for running a build and the tests. I remember when we deployed our application for the database, we essentially went to the Bigtable team and they just gave us like, here's a billion rows in Bigtable. These are the numbers you get to use. And it was already disaster resilient, already highly available, already globally distributed. Everything was basically handled. We just like asked for an allocation and it was handed to us. And when you start a new company and when you continue to build, obviously those are, those things that were built at Google and that developer infrastructure were not built overnight, and obviously built at great expense. And those are the kinds of things I think that made such a huge difference from a productivity standpoint. They made a huge difference from an ability to run experiments. Like if you want to try something new, you want to do, work on some sort of product innovation or additional feature that maybe requires other infrastructure, it was always already there. And it was not only already there, you didn't even need to think about it. It was there and it was reliable and it was high performance and all these other things. And so that's been a really important takeaway, is to really think about, how do we continuously build on top of the internal tooling, the internal infrastructure that focus on developer productivity, and really enabling an environment where people are not going to be held back in pursuing new ideas by infrastructure problems. Moving on from that, I would say at Bridgewater, where we were dealing with a very different level of infrastructure, we actually had, security was an incredibly critical part of everything that we built there. And so just learning kind of security by design, we definitely ran into, when we got to SOC 2 Type 2 and ISO 27001, the gap analyses were actually pretty minor because of all the, so many of the things that me and my CTO, who actually, John Hyman, who was also at Bridgewater with all of us in that same time period, just so much of what we built was already incorporating in a lot of those security principles that were just, they were table stakes at Bridgewater. And I would also say that, an interesting thing reflecting on not just the technical side, but the software development lifecycle, is really learning about how when you have highly technical business processes, that requires intense attention to detail and requirements gathering and discovery. And that's, you're not always doing that when you're building a product for consumers like we were at Google more often. And so to just be able to see both sides of that and understand that, there's one place where, the customer asks you for faster horses and you go build them a car. And then there's other places where the customer asks you for faster horses and you actually just need to bring them faster horses. And understanding, which world you're living in, depending on, what the nature of the requirements are. And so it was great to be able to kind of see both of those worlds, as now when we build more comprehensively across our entire technical ecosystem, definitely both versions exist, no matter what product you're building.
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting, even at Cedar, because we have both sides of that equation, given that we work with large enterprises who want the horses, and then we also build for consumers who are patients and making their lives better. And so we definitely see that trade-off and those differences every day.
Yeah, and when you've got the patient experience you're trying to optimize for, but you're also dealing with things that are highly regulated, you're
exactly.
running into a very similar thing, for sure.
So let me remind you of something you've said in the past. You said once that when you're dealing with truly global nature of mobile and communicating across all channels for different types of companies, you need to be ready at all times for whatever the world throws at you. To meet that challenge, we've had to focus on engineering team growth and build on top of that a host of new technologies to help us deliver our product. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate concretely on what that's meant for Braze in terms of tech and people?
Yeah. One of them is scale challenges. There's kind of two dimensions to this. And when we look at global scale, I alluded to this earlier, but, to have a whole bunch of, for instance, people responding to a campaign or an important cultural event or what have you, with mobile devices looks a lot like a distributed denial of service attack on our systems. And the interesting thing about being global and the App Store was so much more global than even the internet was, because you could drop an app in as a team from anywhere in the world and you're processing payments in 170 countries or what have you. And when we then look at scale problems, our space previously, if you look at all the big email service providers as an example, like Salesforce or Adobe or what have you, for them, large scale was Black Friday in the US. That was like the biggest day of the year for them. And that is just tiny in comparison to the amount of traffic driven by like the Cricket World Cup, as an example, or, big Premier League matches, or Singles Day, even to just take a Black Friday equivalent that's done at much larger scale elsewhere in the world. And not only are those really big events, but for a team that's based in the United States, a lot of them are totally unpredictable because, they're happening in other places around the world. And then often that means that they're happening in the middle of the night because they're not happening in US time zones. So like, it's one thing to know Black Friday is coming, to be able to scale up, to have people on call and paying attention that day. It's another thing to just have these massive important events that are going to lead to huge scale popping up in unpredictable places, around the world at any time. And so that was really interesting. Like when you look at just the breadth of companies that we work with and where they're located and the nature of the load that comes in, we really needed the systems to be able to automatically respond in those cases, or else we were all going to be getting woken up, in the middle of the night all the time and frantically trying to build new infrastructure. And so that's like the kind of the large scale side. The second I would say is really the rapid pace at which the kind of nature and the design of mobile businesses has changed. So I also mentioned this earlier that when we started the company, 2011, there weren't enduring businesses being built in mobile. And certainly to the extent that people were building mobile apps, they didn't have marketing teams, and they definitely didn't have growth teams. And so it's interesting to me that we currently sell to job titles and into team structures that just flat out did not exist when we started the company. And in many ways, those teams have really advanced and become a lot more sophisticated over the last 10 years. So what used to just be, you'd hire a marketing agency to go and kind of, take your ad strategy and try to put it in people's email inbox. Now we look at customer engagement much more holistically. We're integrated into the product experience. We're communicating through the entire customer lifecycle. That means that it's not just the kind of creativity and the traditional CRM or kind of marketing problem, but we're also collaborating with product engineering teams. We're integrating to the UI and UX of their most important product experiences that they're delivering. And we're tying all those things together across channels. And then also engaging with data science teams as well, so that they can continue to kind of look at how we're impacting the product journey, how we're like lifting or not, other various business goals that are there, and really completing what we call that imagine, create, and evolve loop, where I think a lot of it used to just be imagine and try to get people into the top of the funnel, which is not dissimilar to TV advertising strategies from back in the day or what have you, and really moving this to a whole new plane of existence that's interdisciplinary, it's experimental, it's data driven, it's integrated into the product. And so that I think just creates a lot more interfaces that we need to satisfy. It's, I think, a much more fulfilling problem to try and work on, but definitely has its own scale of challenge.
Yeah, I imagine it was very hard to adapt to that, adapting sort of buyer on the other end and
Absolutely.
Still deliver with the same platform. So speaking of scale, you guys recently announced that Braze surpassed $200 million in annual recurring revenue, just 18 months after crossing 100 million. That's extremely impressive. Can you talk about what that experience was like? What short and long-term adjustments you've had to make to sustainably run new business?
Yeah, well, obviously the last 18 months has been one filled with a lot of twists and turns. So the path that we thought was ahead of us from 100 to 200 when we hit 100 is certainly not the one that we walked. And that involved a lot of pandemic response. Obviously, I've gotten a lot closer to our FP&A team over the course of the last year as we've been trying to read the tea leaves and see what's happening, outside in the world with our customers and with their, with the end consumers and human behavior. And so I would say, there's obviously all the normal aspects of scaling, which are just how do we scale to twice as many customers? How do we scale into new geographies? How do we continue to expand into new verticals? And those are all the growth levers that we're continuing to build for. But then also building the muscle of being able to adapt to local conditions as they're changing, I think has been what a lot of the last 18 months has been about. And so organizationally, I've been trying to find opportunities for us to kind of work through additional it's like muscle building around adaptability and resilience, and also enabling teams to be able to just move faster and experiment with more conviction and with more kind of freedom. And so a lot of that has been around being really clear about what the company goals are, but not being super particular about how we're going to implement solutions to those, and really trying to encourage autonomous creativity to thrive, because especially over the last 18 months, it's so hard to empathize with the experience of other people when you barely leave your own home. And especially as the circumstances were ebbing and flowing in a completely different manner, depending on where you were in the world, we just really needed to enable more kind of distributed autonomy and allow for people to test out new things. And then on the back end of that, make sure that there were really good communication mechanisms across the company so that whatever was working or whatever was not could be shared quickly and modeled in other places. And I think those types of things and kind of thinking through those organizational strengths have been the critical components of these last 18 months in particular. And I think that the same things are going to be true, looking over into the next 12 months, because we've all gone through this habit extinction where we've spent the last year, kind of living our lives completely differently than we did before. We're now going to come out of it. And a lot of the ways that we used to live our lives are just not as relevant anymore. And at a minimum, we're given this opportunity to kind of rethink all of our brand loyalties and the ways that we spend our time and what have you. And so there's just going to be huge opportunity for businesses of all kinds as consumers rethink things and they step away from the momentum that was driving them before, and they kind of, are more careful and considered in how they spend their time and their money. And so we're really gearing up to make sure that we can take the adaptability and the resilience that we had to really build over the last 18 months just to survive, right? Or like to continue to kind of navigate the pandemic, and now be able to use those to take advantage of opportunities as we emerge from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that when I asked the question that the pandemic was a key part of that 18 months, but it makes perfect sense.
Yep.
You can get inured to almost anything, I guess. So to switch gears a little bit more to sort of your leadership approach, for both the tech and people sides of the business, were there any assumptions you made and thought would be true during this whole growth phase, but turned out to be completely false? And vice versa, things you thought wouldn't be true and were?
Yeah. So I think, and I've also reflected on this a lot, from a kind of the technology and people sides of the business. I made a transition from being our CTO about 4.5 years ago to taking over as CEO. And that obviously involved an expansion of my purview and my responsibility set to include a lot of departments and teams that were not engineers, right? There's a when you're managing within an engineering team as an engineer, you can I think you can more easily make assumptions about just how people's minds work and how people think through problems, how they like to communicate, et cetera. And so one of the key things I think when thinking about like what's an assumption you made that turned out to be false is that we're all doing this all the time, because humans have a natural tendency to kind of project their own like context, their own experience, motivations on other people. And that means that you're constantly at risk of making assumptions that are false. Like whenever you're working with someone that's motivated differently, that has different skills, different experience, their brain works in a different way, et cetera. I think it's really important to just constantly fight that and remind yourself of it, both from a people perspective. There's also a role for data and technology to play there in order to help kind of remove bias from other sorts of decision making. And so when I think about where are all the places where we're making assumptions that could lead us astray, or where are the places where we're not sure about something, but we want to still strive ahead anyway. A lot of that actually comes down to one, just empathizing with this projection problem and being aware of it, and making sure that we're always doing what we can to put ourselves in the shoes of other people and think through their incentive structures and how that's really how changes are going to work organizationally from that perspective. But then we invest a lot on the data side as well. That helps us, I think, in two ways. One of them is that it does remove bias in decision making when we do have data. When we have data that is of sufficient scope, it's sufficiently detailed, well understood, we can control for biases in it, et cetera. It gives us that really clear North Star about what direction we need to move into, how fast, whether or not we need to course correct, et cetera. But then also having a kind of a measurement culture then frees you on the other side too, which is that if you don't have a ton of conviction behind something, but you want to run the experiment, you want to try something, maybe it's something brand new, so there just is not going to be any data available. By having a good measurement culture, I think you can have conviction to just start running in that direction, because you know that you'll be measuring it along the way, and you can course correct if you need to. And so, in both of those places, we definitely go back to data to help work through those. But the places where that happens are many.
Yeah. See, thinking back on your experience of that transition from CTO to CEO, can you talk about some of the most challenging aspects of that in particular?
Yeah, I think that the first there were things that I just was not involved in before. There are like a lot of things around fundraising, working with the investors. I had been on our board, but hadn't really been, running board meetings and kind of operating at that level of the business. And so there were a whole bunch of things around that where I had to rapidly come up to speed on it. And then obviously the purview kind of expanding beyond just the engineering scope and go out into our entire go-to-market motion, looking at marketing and sales and customer success and support, and then expanding out across the finance function and across all of people and the general administrative kind of G&A side of the business. So you kind of quickly go from living in a world where you've spent a long time getting a lot of specialized education on the nuance of everything that you're working through, and then suddenly are responsible across a much broader set of focus areas. And so I think that was really that was the crux of the harder parts of it. I think also the CEO seat ends up being substantially more complex just because of the human element of it. Working through a leadership team that is everyone kind of works in different ways as well. But the thing that I love about it is actually the same as what makes me excited about being a technologist, which is that in technology, you're constantly solving problems with new technology, new tools, new ideas. You're building on foundations that you've built in the past, and you're able to kind of compound, growth over time in really cool ways. And actually running a fast-growing company and being responsible for that is much the same thing. We're constantly, developing these new muscles. We're building new capabilities. We're rolling out new systems and processes that give us, deeper understanding into things. And we're able to compound all that together and, rapidly grow into solving and conquering new opportunities and challenges. And so, that side of it, if I just kind of conceptually look at it as a technology problem, it ends up having a whole bunch of similarities. And so that's been really engaging and exciting for me. And then, I think that as well, it's been great to be able to kind of be in the seat that I am, but have the technical expertise that I did, both in our own architecture and our own tools, as well as just, the background. And so that's been really great to see, because as we do things like evaluate competitive strategy and partnership strategy and such, to be able to kind of just have that technical understanding to more quickly evaluate these things and separate, what's real from what's hype and all that kind of stuff, I think has been super valuable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm actually going to pull in one of the audience questions because I think it's relevant to this. The question is from someone anonymous who says, as CEO, I assume you don't get to be technically involved like you used to be. What was the transition from CTO to CTO like, and do you still keep your technical chops at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm certainly not as technically involved as I used to, just because there's not enough hours in the day. And I've done a lot to try and stay involved. Obviously, I stay involved here through working really closely with all of our product engineering leadership on a regular basis. I also do a ton of reading in order to just keep up on everything going on in the world. I also the only coding I'm doing these days is actually around hobby work, but I try to keep that moving. It's not in the same developer infrastructure as what we're doing today. I think it would probably take me at least a full day to get up and running on all of the new all the new container infrastructure and the new developer tooling and our, how all of our CI and CD systems work and everything, because it's all evolved quite a bit. And I unfortunately have kind of lost track of that side of it. I can't do Braze Dev on my laptop anymore, and that I held on to that for at least the first 2 or 3 years. But one of these new laptop transitions that happened along the way, I just never got the time to set it back up. So you kind of slowly see those things, fall away, and it is definitely sad. But I consider it an enormous part of my job responsibility to keep up on everything happening in the technical world and continue to keep myself sharp from that perspective. And so I still invest a lot of time in that. But interestingly, the very first thing that you notice is that you're not a reliable teammate anymore in terms of building the software. So it's even though I still could, and I still had enough context on the systems, and I still occasionally answer technical questions from things where I show up in the Git blame, or what have you. But to actually be in a project, you need to not have things where like you just need to go disappear for a week because you got to go work on some other sort of business problem or whatever, and you can't be a reliable part of the team. And so that was what actually kind of first pulled me out of being able to be involved in those. And then it does drift away over time unless you stay focused on it.
Yeah, I can relate to that a little bit as well. So let's call back to some of the lessons learned we were talking about earlier. What were some lessons you learned at MIT that were immensely valuable to you, and some other things that you learned that were completely wrong, other than the networking thing?
Yeah, other than the networking thing. Yeah, the networking thing is definitely a big one. I think one of the things that MIT, they instill in you from the very beginning is like, we're gonna teach you a bunch of stuff, but the more important thing that we're gonna teach you is how to learn. And that always keeping in mind like kind of the meta process that you're learning along the way, in addition to what you're doing now. I mentioned that a few times as we talked about navigating through the pandemic and how taking a step back from the things we're investing in as an organization and saying, not just the goals of this project, but actually this is a new type of project that we've never undertaken before. And so we're trying to build that muscle to be able to kind of, take something from beginning to end in this way, or to be able to carve out, a SWAT team and chase after this, or to be able to do this thing geographically and then model it globally. Always kind of keeping in mind that along the way, we're not just learning the thing, we're also learning, the process, and making sure that we're able to then make investments along those lines. So I definitely credit, MIT's approach to learning with a lot of how I think about that from an organizational learning standpoint. And then, other than the network, I think that the value and importance of go-to-market in business is certainly not instilled in you when you're in kind of deeply entrenched in an engineering, culture and engineering environment. You definitely kind of, as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed engineer, have this like field of dreams mentality where like if you just build a great product, people are gonna figure out how to use it and they're gonna pay you for it and you'll be able to build the business. And the reality is far from the truth. And so to just that was not part of, I think, the entrepreneurial education that I received there. At least certainly there was an exposure to that, and so that's been a big part of my own learning. As an entrepreneur, has been on the go-to-market side.
Yeah, and I think go-to-market is one of those things that even if you've actually heard about it, like until you actually experience it, you never really can grok it. And I think a lot of people suffer from that, especially engineers, like you mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so important to success. So, it's to to a large extent, that field of dreams mentality, the quicker you get over that, the better off you're going to be from a business perspective.
Agreed. All right. Well, let me ask you a different sort of version of the international scope problem that you talked about before. You mentioned like not knowing what the different sort of events that happen globally are. Are there other specific challenges you have faced? Because your startup itself is global as well, right? You have offices all over the world, and you have distributed teams. What is your advice on that, especially as we adapt more hybrid models across the board?
Yeah, the hybrid and the remote side is interesting on this, because if you had asked me that exact question, 18 months ago, one of the things that we found to be really important as we open new offices is making sure that there's at least enough of a critical mass in any area that we're planning to open that they're able to develop their own identity. And so there's this interesting tension between like, you open an office in London or Singapore or what have you, or even just halfway across the United States, is that you want to have the connection to the global, entity, and a connection back to headquarters. We also want them to be able to like stand on their own, have their own kind of cultural identity, and their own kind of local culture. And it's hard to do that if you've only got a handful of people in any particular place. And so, especially in our early days, you go and you're like, all right, we're ready to expand into London, but we're only at the scale where we can budget like a few people to start there. And we were like, we tried that into some of our earliest offices, and we actually shifted gears. We're like, until we're ready to hire 10 people like all at the same time, we're just not even gonna try to open these other offices. And 10 actually, I think the ideal number is even higher than that, to be able to kind of pull together that critical mass, get a little bit of interdisciplinary collaboration going on back and forth, and really think about who the culture carriers are going to be and how you're going to kind of stand people up. we recently expanded into Tokyo actually during the pandemic, which was an interesting challenge because it was extremely hard to get into the country. And I think that one of the most important aspects of that is that we actually had someone who had been with the business for over 4 years. They were a Japanese permanent resident. It almost didn't even matter what their job role was. They just knew the Braze organization. And so we had that person actually moved out to Japan. They're still there today, and have been living there for the last 9 months, helping that team come up to speed. And so I think that's a really big part of it. I think that's going to be a challenge that we look at, how do we integrate a more remote and hybrid workforce in, is that a lot of the things that we depended on to build community had an assumption built into them that we would be together, in person, maybe not all the time, but at least enough, and have like a regional hub connection. So we're working on thinking through a lot of that. I think also, the way that your culture grows and the way that you articulate your culture, I think is really important. And so, to use an easy kind of engineering analogy, it's like you don't define your culture as the particular instantiation that it is today or that it is in a particular location. You need to define and talk about your culture with like kind of higher level values and higher level principles so that they can be properly adapted depending on, what scale a particular office or kind of community is in a particular place or at different stages of the business. And so I think that's really critical. Like whenever you're talking about values and culture, to have an eye toward, what does this look like for people elsewhere in the world? What does this look like if, your office or your team are 5 people instead of 50 or instead of 500? What does this look like when the business is thousands of people instead of the size that it is today? And we're onboarding just as many people every quarter as the entire company is right now, and really trying to stress test them to the extent that you can. These things are obviously very hard to anticipate, but to really look at those problems and stare them down before they're already on your doorstep.
Yeah, I guess there's an analogy there with technical systems too, where you should think through what the new scales might be and where the boundary positions might be. So let me ask you about a more regional type of question as well. What do you think is the biggest advantage and the biggest disadvantage of having a tech startup in New York versus Silicon Valley?
Oh, that's a timely question as well. I think the biggest advantages all come down to the diversity of the city. It's so far from being a one industry town, right? New York City has got so much culture in it, so much diversity of schools and across every single industry, and the people themselves. There's more languages spoken in Queens than any city in the world, and so I think that's just, we're able to tap into such a rich tapestry of backgrounds and experiences and people and everything else. And so that is the thing I think I could never give up about the New York startup environment. The disadvantage is, definitely has to do with scaling. I would say that this is also something that is getting better in New York, but there huge, multi-billion, multi-tens of billion, like multi-hundred billion value, like software companies are not we're not or are not, depending on what scale we're talking about, headquartered here. And so if you want the kind of leadership that has been there, done that at your next level of scale, there's just a lot more of those people out in Silicon Valley than there are in New York. And a lot of those people also, just by virtue of them being kind of been there, done that leaders, they've got families, they've got more roots down, et cetera. They're a little bit harder to get to relocate. And so I think that has probably been the enduring challenge, is just the, getting the been there, done that experience for software companies at massive scale. When we look at Braze, with multiple billions of monthly active users and the scale that we manage it at, it's like there's not that many technical systems in the world that are already operating at that scale. And almost all of them are actually headquartered up in Silicon Valley. And so to just find people with that pre-existing experience and bring them into New York, or find them in New York is a little bit more challenging. We've obviously decided that on balance, we would prefer this environment for our headquarters, but that is a material challenge.
Yeah, I hear you. I guess we'll just have to grow our own leaders and make big enough companies that those people move here.
Absolutely. I mean, that's been the marching orders the last 10 years for us. So.
Yeah. So before I switch to audience questions, I wanted to ask you one thing. Braze's rate of messaging, it's aspirational for a company like Cedar right now. What, in your experience, do you think is the best advice you can give for us, especially in the wake of the Series D, where we're going to try to expand and grow to that kind of scale very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the high level advice is like stay focused on the patient experience, because as you're scaling, you're gonna whatever you measure is going to be what you're going to optimize for. And as you go through kind of scaling, anything that you're not paying close attention to, like you know like latency of all kinds, or like the ability to personalize at scale, or the ability to kind of maintain or accommodate preferences, or like just correctness problems, like all kinds of things, like to be able to look at and optimize for the patient experience across all of those, so that while you're at the seat of your pants, trying to just like hold on for dear life and scale, you don't lose sight of those really important things. And then I think there's a corollary to that too, which is that scaling is a very human problem as well. Doing things like tracking the number of overnight pages and making sure that that's in your OKRs for the developer, and the human experience on your side, right alongside the patient experience, for the human experience for the customers, and just kind of measuring a lot of those quality of life things for your own team as well. Because, the scaling stuff, like, you're going to tackle that. That's, a lot of those technical problems are going to be specific and nuanced. But I think making sure that you're still kind of broadly measuring the things that are going to make the business successful, and that are going to make the team's quality of life, stay in a good place all along the way.
Yeah, that's really great to hear, because it validates both one of our core company values, which is focus on the mission, specifically the patient experience, and an internal sort of management philosophy of being people first. I think both resonate with what you just said. All right. Well, I think I've asked you enough questions, and I can always ask you more offline, but let me get some audience questions in here for you. Here's a question from our chief architect, Taylor Hicks. He wants to know, what was the specific biggest scaling problem that happened at Braze, and how did you end up fixing it?
So I would say probably the biggest ongoing scaling, well, there's kind of two levels of this, but they're actually both of them are related to the load that we put on our database. I mentioned the thundering herd problem before. That hits the network, but it also, when we're doing like a large messaging, especially if it's like kind of multiple concurrent large messaging blasts, there's a whole bunch of load on the user profiles, because we need to read them in order to determine whether or not they're eligible, orchestrate. Then we need to be able to pull properties out of them to personalize messaging. Then we need to write down that the campaign happened, and then be ready kind of in that pipeline, that when the message is sent and they open it, that then might lead them down another path. So we need to kind of work through the workflow. So there's just a tremendous amount of pressure on the database there. And so so we use MongoDB for our document-based storage for these user profiles. And then the stream processor depends on the ability to both read and write to it, multiple times as it kind of moves through. And we are operating a MongoDB instance that is potentially, it's hard to know this, but we seem to be running one that is like the largest, or at least the most load or demand in the world. And what that meant was that basically every new version that they rolled out, we broke it, because their test rigs just like were not operating at the same scale as our production environment. And so that meant that as they kind of continued to develop, and we needed to rely on new capabilities and new stability improvements, in order for us to keep up with scale and them to keep up with us, unfortunately, they also were not like kind of testing at our scale. And so we were always a guinea pig on that. And so, that's, I don't know if I would call that completely fixed, right? That's definitely an ongoing journey. One of the ways that we have, I would say the closest thing we've done to fixing it is also related to just the broader scaling problems, that we've started to scale entire clusters horizontally. And so we started out with USO1, well, what became called USO1 back in the day. And we actually sealed that off way too late. We already had 900 million monthly active users on that cluster before we built another one. Due to growth of customers on that cluster, it's now like 1.7 billion or something. It's grown tremendously from there. And we have call it double that in monthly active users across the whole kind of customer base, but we actually now have, I think, 6 or 8 clusters in total. And so effectively what we've been able to do there is USO1 taught us how to scale up to a pretty high amount. And USO1 therefore still is the first cluster to run into a lot of new scaling problems as we reach certain levels. But then we have confidence that, the rest of the system, who are all sitting around 100 million or 300 million or whatever, depending on what geography they're in or how we've deployed certain customers onto them, we have confidence that those can easily scale to much larger size because we've got an example sitting right there in US01. And so I would say that, one thing that if there's a learning in there, it's certainly seal off that first cluster and get the second one set up like well before you need to. You can always add more load to a cluster, but it's hard to take a live running application, especially with, there's constantly updating the data stores and such. To be able to move from one cluster to the other is actually a pretty laborious process. And so, just trying to think about that horizontal scaling at the highest level early on, so that you've got that in your toolbox as you continue to grow is super important.
That's really funny that you say that, Taylor. I promise we did not prepare this, and I did not tell him to say that. He just happens to agree. So let's ask you another question. This is actually from Kayla from our Bridgewater days. She's at Cedar now. She first of all really likes your new hair, apparently, but she wants to ask you, what advice would you have for evolving your tech stack, specifically transitioning from older technologies to newer solutions as the business evolves?
Yeah, I would say probably the most important learning is when you introduce new technologies, we've always tried to pair it with new products that have both less scale demands on them and also less customer expectations for exactly how they should work. So I mentioned earlier as an example that commercial stream processors like Confluent didn't exist when we started the company, right? So we rolled our own stream processor in the early days, but we wanted to also be able to use some of the offerings from Confluent as we built out, distributed logged and kind of distributed stream processing architectures. And so when we did that, instead of trying to replace the existing pipeline that was already being depended on for mission critical message sending, we actually found a brand new product area, which is currently our product called Currents, which is data streaming out. So we can kind of take any data we generate and push it into data warehouses or into product analytics companies or what have you, or into CDPs. And so that was something that, by virtue of it being a new product, we could release it into beta. We could control the customers that were coming into it. We could kind of trickle them in. And so we would be able to learn the new scale when we could have a custom SLA and SLO for it because it was a brand new product. We weren't going to need to adhere to massive scale and massive expectations. So we were able to kind of do growing pains and ramp the scale up, either with dog fooding or internal use cases, or with clients that were going to beta test with us. And then once we got the confidence at scale, then we start to look at places where we want to replace pre-existing systems with this new, now battle-tested technology. And we've done that in a lot of places as we've looked to kind of optimize in various areas where we've got sending services as an example for sending push notifications that we've re-architected a few times because those are running billions and billions and billions of times. So microseconds matter, right? And so to turn those into microservices that were like written in highly optimized Go, Golang, back in the day, those were things where we also picked parts of the push notification sending that were less mission critical, that were at lower scale, and just making sure that you're kind of staging those out, whether that's staging from a business standpoint in terms of how you charge, or obviously kind of staged or progressive rollouts are just standard operating procedure for a lot of releases. But for brand new technology, I think it's also worth thinking about it at the SKU level and the customer kind of experience level, and how that plays into a lot of the demands there.
Yeah, that's really good. I agree with that. Let's switch gear to slightly, I guess, less technical questions. Someone asked, as a leader, did you ever have to make a decision that you didn't personally agree with? In hindsight, would you make the same choice?
Humans are so good at back rationalization that it's hard to come up with examples of that. I would definitely say that there's a lot of places, especially when I get outside of my element, right, where I'm working on go-to-market problems, like working through pricing or kind of customer sentiment or what have you, where I think it's important to be cognizant of one's own believability and know where you're ignorant of things, and where other people are, are the experts and have, in a lot of cases, decades of experience dealing with the human side of certain problems. This comes into play in enterprise sales all the time. And so there's definitely a lot of places where I'll just kind of take the lead from, my sales leaders or from others on how to run a process. And in some cases, it's not like intuitive to me, or it doesn't really agree with my experience. But I put that aside, knowing that they're the expert in their craft. And we move along with it. And then absolutely, in so many of those cases, like, they're right because they're experienced and they're the experts in it. And so I think that, broadly, it's just important to understand, like, when you are an expert, when you have a well-reasoned and a good reason that your experience matches the context of where you're trying to make decisions. And by all means, hold your conviction through that. But when the tables are turned, be humble about it and, follow other people's leads in those cases.
Yeah, I think there's a good joke about general relativity where people say it doesn't make common sense, but it applies at scales that aren't your common experience. So why would it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So another person asked, in your reading that you mentioned a lot earlier in the interview, is there anything you've seen recently that sticks out? I think they're talking to the reading you mentioned earlier in the first half of the interview.
There's so much noise out there in the world. I would say that. So speaking about the reading I do just kind of technically and keeping up on the world and such, I would say one piece of advice I would provide is to just be ruthless about, like, sources of information, and realize when, I go to data, go to primary source documents a lot when I'm trying to, like, read through and understand things. Like, when we went through COVID as an example, like, there was just massive noise and confusion and analysis in all different directions, and it was, like, important to just always go to the data. Go to, if you're interested in something going on, like, don't read the kind of CNN version of the medical study. Just go find the medical study. It's all available. And so I think in a lot of cases, just kind of going to being ruthless about sources, cutting things off that are not analyzing things at the depth that are going to really move the needle for you from an understanding perspective, and constantly being kind of on the search for new kind of interesting originators of, like, ideas and such. So I think that's been important. Is, like, it's really easy to feel like you're making yourself informed by just reading a lot of news. But in so many cases, there's just, like, the abstraction layers and the noise that gets injected into that means that you're not really moving forward in deeper understanding. And so that would be my primary advice: is really scrutinize and challenge yourself on sources.
Yeah, but don't you think that at some level our technological future is also making that harder, because we're acclimatizing people to these shorter burst, highly condensed information sources, which don't really lend themselves to deeper analysis?
Yeah, and a lot of our publishing platforms as well, like, they don't make any kind of distinctions between experts and amateurs and things like that. And so, yeah, I think it is really hard. And that's why it's important to be, to constantly question and kind of be ruthless about things too, because, even your go-to news source might be set adrift, or maybe they hire a set of writers that are just kind of, off in left field or whatever. And just definitely scrutinize that side of what you're reading and make sure that it's worth your time.
Yeah, I remember that old Google News feature of showing alternate opinions on the same topic, and that somehow vanished from the news app a while back.
Yeah. Along with the entire Google Reader application, was a sad death.
Exactly. Well, Bill, thank you so much. I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wealth of experience with everybody. And as usual, it's been really fun hanging out with you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was great to, I know I can't see the audience, but it was great to see some familiar names in the chat, as well as just see the engagement. So it's been great. And, I hope to visit your guys' offices in person again relatively soon. I can bring guest star Brooklyn, my dog, who I know has been there a couple times, and it'd be great to see you all again.
Yeah, we'll make that happen. And thank you, everybody in the audience. I can't see you either, but I really appreciate your engagement, your thoughtful questions, and just joining us for this.
Absolutely. Cheers. Have a great rest of the day.